Welcome to Biblical Leadership Lecture number 3. In today's lecture, what we're going to attempt to do is give a very brief overview of the Christian worldview. And this would be basically the Christian idea or view of the origin of the world, and then also how the Christian worldview would account for the existence of God and the existence of the entire universe that we see around us. And again, it'll be just a very brief overview, a summary. This is not a class intended to just focus on this subject, so it will just be a very brief summary of this argument for the Christian view of the world. The study of defending the Christian worldview or defending a biblical view of life is actually called the study of apologetics, or it's the field of apologetics. And apologetics, this is an English term that we use that actually originated from a Greek word that is apologia. The Greek word apologia means a defense. It is basically talking about a written or spoken defense that you would give for a set of beliefs that you hold. And so the idea of apologetics is offering up a defense for a system of belief. Christian apologetics would focus on the defense of the Christian worldview. And one of the early apologists was a man named Justin Martyr. And Justin Martyr actually wrote a book that he titled The Apologia. And this was his defense of the early Christian faith, early on in the New Testament church age. He wrote this book to the head of the Roman government. At this time, Christianity was not viewed very favorably because the Roman government believed that Christians were actually in opposition to their governmental system, and so they had all kinds of misconceptions and different beliefs about these individuals who called themselves Christians. And so Justin Martyr wrote a book to the emperor, the Roman emperor who was living at the time, to try and explain or defend the viewpoints of Christianity. And again, this book was called the Apologia, or the defense. Some of the things that the Roman government misunderstood is that they had heard that the Christians were meeting in secret, which they were, because they were being persecuted by those outside of the Christian faith, and specifically individuals in authority in the Roman government. And so they were meeting in secret in the catacombs and other places that they would be able to meet without fear of disruption from the Roman government. So they were meeting in secret, which already drew attention. And then, in addition to this, rumor was that these early Christians were cannibals, because the stories that were leaking out from these secret meetings is that they were drinking the blood of human beings and eating the flesh of human beings. And in reality, all these early Christians were doing is simply taking communion. They were drinking grape juice or wine, and they were eating bread. And we know, understanding what communion commemorates or celebrates, that they were just simply doing this in fulfillment of Scripture and in obedience to Scripture, rather. And in this process of communion, memorializing the death of Jesus Christ, they were drinking the wine representing his blood and eating the bread representing his body. It was not actually human blood or human flesh, but the rumor that got back to the Roman government was that this was cannibalism. And so part of what Justin Martyr attempted to do was to write a defense of this practice of communion and explain the misconceptions, and also refute this idea that the early Christians were involved in cannibalistic practices. And so the field of apologetics has come into being, especially from a Christian perspective, defending the Christian faith since the time of Justin Martyr. It still continues today, where we are simply making a logical, rational defense of our system of belief, our biblical worldview, and that study of apologetics is simply a formal defense of the Christian faith. Apologetics, from a Christian perspective, is largely built upon the three main arguments for the existence of God. And just to kind of briefly walk through these, the ontological argument, this is an argument that is built around the idea of God being the greatest conceivable being. It seems very simple to state it, but much more difficult to understand. But the argument goes something like this, that God is the greatest conceivable being that human beings can think of in their minds. And if he is the greatest conceivable being, then existence has to be a part of his character or nature. Because to exist is greater than to not exist. And you have to really think about that for a moment, but that is the crux of this argument, that existence is greater than non-existence. So it would be greater for a being that we are thinking of in our minds to have the attribute of existence than for a being that we can think of in our minds to not have the attribute of existence. And so if God is the greatest conceivable being, then by rational default, he has to exist, because to exist is greater than to not exist. And that is the very basic definition of the ontological argument, that God is the greatest conceivable being, and if he is the greatest, then he has to exist, because it is greater to exist than not exist. The cosmological argument is an argument that has often been called the argument of first cause. It would go something like this, that if anything exists in the world, then you have to account for that existence. In other words, we know that out of nothing, nothing comes. So if there ever was a time in the world where there was nothing, then there would be nothing still. But something had to be there, something eternal that has always been there, that has to exist in order for there to be something in existence today. So if we can agree that something exists, then we know that existence had to come from something. And then the question is, what is that something? And this argument would say that something is an eternal, self-existent God who has always been, and it is from him that all of life and the universe emanates, that he is the original first cause, the uncaused cause, that he has always existed, and from him everything we see in the universe got its start. The teleological argument is an argument from design. It says that when you look at the world around us, you see design and order, structure in everything that you look at, whether it's the human eye or the solar system, the animal kingdom. And when you think about the design that is there, it points to a designer. You cannot have design from randomness. And so this teleological argument would look at the structure of the universe and say that it screams out for there to be a designer, and that designer would be God. In addition to these theological arguments, we can also provide other sources for our argument of a Christian worldview. We have the argument for the authority of Scripture, whether it's looking at the historical Jesus, the writings of Josephus, other writings from antiquity that would point to the fact that there was historical evidence, documented evidence for the life and existence of Jesus Christ on earth, or archaeological evidence that points to the reliability of the Bible, we would look at Scripture as being another reason for our belief in the Christian faith, that the Scriptures have to be accounted for in some way, that there is a uniqueness to them, a significance to them that you must account for, and we would use that as another piece of evidence in our case for the authority of the Christian worldview. Finally, Christianity provides a reasonable answer to the basic questions of life. If God does not exist, then of course no amount of arguing will make him go away. And if he does not exist, then no amount of arguing will make him come true. We cannot argue him into existence. It's an either-or situation. Either he does exist or he does not. And if he does exist, then no amount of arguing or denying his existence will change that fact. And if he indeed doesn't exist, then no amount of arguing will make him appear or come into being. The Apostle Paul said that if God does not exist, then we as Christians are of all men most miserable. We are staking everything that we have on this idea of the existence of God.